Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our third and final day of the second annual HPPA Symposium. Today's track will focus on old buildings and new perspectives. My name is Zoe Murad. If you haven't met me yet or I haven't said hello, I'm a newly minted HPP grad. I graduated just this past weekend from the program, and I'm really happy to be here with everybody and entering into this really strong alumni network. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, obviously the purpose of this event is for us to get together, but to also serve as a platform for everyone to share the work that they've been doing of alumni and current students. So this symposium has 3 tracks. We've arrived at the third and final track here today, but just to recap, Friday we kicked off the symposium with our keynote lecture from Trudy Sandmeyer, HPP class of 2000. Saturday saw our first track with the next generation, which showcased the work of current students and recent alumni. After that was our second session, Preservation Education, which focused on the current state and future outlook of preservation, education, and coursework priorities. And finally, we've arrived today at our final track, Old Buildings, New Perspectives, which will feature projects and presentations from forward-thinking alumni implementing innovative methods to preserve unique historic resources and address preservation challenges. So this event would not have been possible without the support of the HPPA members, of course, as well as the guidance and expertise and encouragement we've received from our advisor, Professor Michael Tomlin. And I'd also like to recognize the hard work and dedication of the other members of the Symposium Planning Committee, including Michelle Anderson, HPP class of 2018, Mayar Hadigi, HPP class of 2012, Melanie Coulter Madrano, HPP class of 2017, and then my colleague, Angela Fernandez, who will graduate next year. So finally, you've all been here, but just a few housekeeping items. We would love to see everyone's faces, so if you're able, feel free to turn on your camera. However, stay muted during the presentations. That would be great. And second, you can change the way that you can view the presentations with or without the audience gallery by clicking on the view icon. And at the end of each presentation, please use the raise hand function under the reactions tab. You can also use the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that as well for the Q&A sessions. And then as a reminder, we are going to be recording each of the sessions so that we can share the videos on the HPPA website and on YouTube in the coming weeks as well. So our lineup this morning will begin with Kara Hamley O'Donnell, HPP class of 95, and Maura Johnson, HPP class of 85. And then followed by Michelle Anderson, HPP class of 18. And then we'll hear from Jenny Rowan, HPP 17, and Sean McGee, HPP 16. And then finally, to round out today, our final keynote speaker, Bob Yeager, from the class of 1985 will round out our symposium. So we will begin today with a preservation plan for a 200-year-old cemetery in Shaker Heights, Ohio, presented by Kara Hamley O'Donnell and Maura Johnson. Kara is the principal planner for the city of Shaker Heights, where she works on managing planning processes, corridor and area planning and implementation, community engagement, public art administration, and grant writing in this streetcar suburb of Shaker Heights, all built on her preservation background and appreciation of the architecture and planning practices of the 1910s through 20s. Prior to her work in Shaker Heights, Kara worked for the adjacent first ring suburb of Cleveland Heights for 25 years as the historic preservation planner, where she oversaw the city's historical center, guided 7 National Register historic district nominations, and staffed the city's landmark and preservation planning commissions. She also ran the storefront renovation program and guided redevelopment and preservation projects. She has occasionally also taught historic preservation classes at Ursuline College. And Maura Johnson is the Cultural Resources Group Manager at the Manick and Smith Group, a civic engineering environmental consulting firm in Maumee, Ohio, where she is responsible for scoping, budgeting, supervising, and executing all types of cultural resource projects. Prior to her current position, Maura worked for 8 years as the Northwest Regional Coordinator for the Ohio SHPO, providing technical assistance and support to a 19-county service area in Northwest Ohio. During that time, she was also a part-time instructor at Bowling Green State University, where she taught classes in historic preservation, architectural history and theory, and material culture studies. Before Ohio, Maura was community development coordinator for a certified local government program in Liberty, Missouri. And she says that her best job ever was doing a survey of Route 66 for the Missouri Route 66 Association. So I will just talk for one small more minute to tell you about the presentation. And this presentation will discuss the city of Shaker Heights 1-acre Warrensville West Cemetery that dates to 1811 and has fallen into a state of disrepair like so many other retired cemeteries. It's the final resting place of pioneer families, Manse settlers, veterans of 5 wars, founders of Warrenville's Township, and North Union Shakers. So the plan to guide and contract with the city needed guidance and contracted with the Manick and Smith Group and Historic Gravestone Services. The plan completed in 2022 includes inventory and existing conditions and provides a framework for improving the landscape and amenities at the cemetery, enhancing its placemaking potential, preserving its historic features and characters, and making it sustainable for the next 200 years. So without me talking anymore, I'm going to turn it over to Kara and Maura.
I apologize. A bunch of screens opened up at the same time, so
that's okay.
Okay. You can see my screen yet?
Yep, that's great.
Give me 1 second. All right. So thank you. I was remembering this morning that one of my regular walk from my downtown apartment to Cornell was through that Ithaca City Cemetery that sort of connected the two. And I have always found cemeteries fascinating. So this has been a fun project to work on. Shaker Heights is a nationally known streetcar suburb, and it was designed in the Garden City tradition around 2 streetcar lines, I apologize. And it's connected directly to downtown's Cleveland Terminal Tower. This ad on the left sort of shows that vision of the Terminal Tower in the background, which was a marketing piece at the time the community was developed. We have
Eric, you need to advance your slide.
Oh, shoot. Sorry.
Because it's a great illustration.
It is a great illustration. Thank you so much, Maura. And so the city is made up of, we have a lot of grand Tudors and colonial revivals that were constructed in the teens and the 20s. And the streetcar line and the homes remain virtually unchanged over the last 100 years. But the cemetery's history does predate the redevelopment of Shaker Heights by the Van Swearingen Company. And so I'm going to have Maura share a little bit of that history.
Yeah, so the history is not well represented by the slides I've got here, so pardon me as I go down this written history. The Warrensville West Cemetery is located within the Shaker Town Center Commercial District. It's just over 1 acre in size, and it's maintained and owned by the city of Shaker Heights. For those unfamiliar with Ohio neighborhood, Shaker Heights is about 10 miles east-southeast of Cleveland Center. Both are located in Cuyahoga County, which is seated on the southern shore of Lake Erie in Northeast Ohio. Shaker Heights was originally part of Warrensville Township, shown here, which was named for Daniel Warren, the first permanent non-indigenous settler in the township, who established a claim here in 1810. In 1811, his 2-year-old daughter, Lovisa, died and was buried on a ridge at the edge of this property, the site of the present-day Warrensville Cemetery. This first burial in 1811 makes it the second oldest burial ground in Cuyahoga County. Warren sold the burial site in 1812, and the property was subsequently transferred to Warrensville Township for use as a community cemetery. In 1822, and this is really a very unique piece of history. In 1822, the North Union Shaker community had established a 1,400-acre farm on the site of present-day Shaker Heights. The Shaker community dissolved in 1889, and the farmland was acquired in 1905 by the Van Sweringen brothers, who planned to develop a Garden City suburb on the former Shaker farm. As part of their development plan, the Van Sweringens relocated the remains of 89 North Union Shakers from the original Shaker burial ground to a common grave at the Warrensville West Cemetery in 1909. As Shaker Heights, oh, we can go to the next slide.
Thank you.
As Shaker Heights took form, including the adoption of strict architectural guidelines, the rural cemetery at its heart became the object of some concern. An initiative was made in the 1920s to improve the cemetery, which is shown here on the far left. You can see that the cemetery was, the first burial was on a ridge, and you can see a little bit of the change in scenery and the excavation of the major road, Lee Road. I think, Carrie, you said this might have been when the road was under construction.
It looks like it.
But Lee Road, apparently, and I don't know if it was renamed from an earlier road name, but Lee, his mother, Ann Lee, who established the Shaker community. Next slide. The current stone retaining walls were added in the 20s. A stone marker for the Shaker burials was placed in 1949. And in 1959, a state historical marker was dedicated, shown there on the right. The cemetery was designated a local landmark in 1976 and is a contributing resource in the Shaker Village National Register Historic District, which was listed in 1984. Next.
Okay. Today, as Maura alluded to, the cemetery has been developed. It reminds me of one of my favorite books of my childhood, the little house, where the house is surrounded as the community builds up around it. And so the cemetery is right there in one of the busiest parts of the city. The rapid transit line is just north of there. The access to the cemetery today is through at the lower right corner, which you go through a grocery store parking lot to get to the cemetery. And in recent years, the state of the cemetery had really concerned some residents. In 2019, a group of environmentally minded residents offered to remove some of the overgrown and invasive species. And they also did some research on the potential to use ground penetrating radar. In 2019, the Shaker Heights Historical Society, the Shaker Heights Library, and the City of Shaker and its Landmark Commission offered free tour of the cemetery, and the registration was filled up within like hours of it being open. So there was a real interest in the history of the cemetery. We sort of decided that was an important time to build on that excitement that was within the community, and also to stop and think before we decided to let people go in there without a plan in place. And so we sort of said, put a pin in it, and we decided that we would sort of look at what our opportunities were. The cemetery had been obscured behind this retaining wall and evergreen shrubs since the 1930s. In fact, it's one of those roads that, living in this area, I've driven down hundreds, if not thousands of times. And before I started working for the City of Shaker, I had no idea there was a cemetery back there. And so it was one of those things that we needed to kind of get the word out about the cemetery and its condition. And then my slides are doing some very strange things behind the scenes. Sorry, guys. And as Maura noted, this is a cemetery that has not had burials in it since the 1950s, and the maintenance was basically we mowed the lawn. So without a plan, we didn't have the expertise to know what to do or how to do it. And this is the conditions on the other side of that wall I just showed you. And as you can see, that hedgerow has long outgrown its life and is doing severe damage to the stones. There are also stones, we believe, underneath those bushes now that we couldn't even access because of the overgrowth. So we decided to talk to the State Historic Preservation Office, ask them for some examples of good plans, that we could sort of use as a guide. And basically they said, in Ohio, we have no good plans for cemeteries, no new preservation plans. And so we sort of used that to our benefit when we applied for a CLG grant and said, there's no good plan. Ours could be one that other people could look at as a guide for their historic cemeteries. And at the same time, we lucked out. The governor had announced that preservation of historic cemeteries was a state goal. So we did get that CLG grant, and then we hired the Manick Smith team. It was a team that consisted of landscape architects, archaeologists, historic preservationists, Maura, and a ground penetrating radar technician, a cemetery specialist, and a gravestone restoration expert who was a subcontractor. Her name was Tamara Conde of Historic Gravestone Services in Massachusetts. And from the start, we knew it was really important to engage the community. They'd already become engaged, and we wanted to also educate people that the cemetery actually existed. And so from the start, we had project partners in the Historical Society and the Shaker Heights Local History Division of the library. When MSG gave us the response to the RFP, they included, we didn't ask for it, but they included 2 neighborhood workshops, one was for gravestone restoration and one was for our public works staff. And we loved that idea. Later in that process, sort of based on their workshops, our Historical Society and Library added a Veterans Day tour to engage and educate the broader community that maybe didn't know about this or was more interested in veterans issues versus preservation issues. And but at that tour, we did share information about our progress on the preservation plan. So we started this planning process in the fall of 21, and then we just completed and adopted the plan in March. I apologize, my notes keep disappearing. Again, we started this process with an 11-person stakeholder committee made of residents, and they met twice with the consultants. We did this during COVID, so that's why everybody's so spread out. We had a couple meetings indoors, but we also did meetings on site. And we leveraged resident expertise. We had residents who were professors of history. We had preservationists, archaeologists, landscape designers and landscape architects, native species specialists and architect, and people who just had that on the ground knowledge of the neighborhood itself. We came up with goals as a stakeholder group. Throughout the entire process, we discussed how sustainability was an underlying aspect of all of the plan. Economic sustainability, social inclusion, and environmental and historic resource protection were really important. And that list was guided by the stakeholder group. And then once we had our goals in place, then we were ready to start the plan. I'm going to pass it off to Maura, who can talk to you about the next portions of it.
Well, the first part of any plan, of course, is to identify what your resources are. And we had a couple of outstanding questions. You can see on the top right corner of the figure that there are not, okay, this is the GPR results. So in the next slide, you'll see the location of headstones. Naturally over time, and you can see the deteriorated conditions. Oh, excuse me, yeah. That's top right. Deteriorated conditions at the cemetery. We'd lost a lot of headstones. It was uncertain exactly where the burials had occurred. And particularly, we had a marker to show the location of those 89 relocated shakers down at the bottom right-hand corner. But we didn't exactly know the location. There wasn't a lot of information about where those were located. So that push mower type equipment, there is a ground penetrating radar equipment, and we use that to the equipment was set out on a grid, and I'm no technical expert. I was not directly involved in this, but we gathered information basically using radio waves to locate anomalies beneath the ground to identify where concentrations of burials may have been occurred, or where ground disturbance occurred, or where there were voids, or where there were objects in the ground. So I think we identified 134 potential burial sites using the GPR. And for non-technical people, GPR operates by transmitting electromagnetic impulses or radio waves into the subsurface and measuring the time for a reflected signal to return to the receiving antenna, which is the lawnmower object. So we're pretty happy with that. Next slide. And identifying resources obviously meant getting out in the field and looking at what was there. Tamara Conde is there on the left. Our archaeologist, Kate Hayfield, is on the right. They did a detailed inventory of all the identifiable headstones and markers on there. We had a pretty comprehensive list of burials at the site, but we didn't know locations per se. The surveyors took photographs of the building. They took GPS coordinates of the building so we could incorporate that into the mapping and planning landscape plan. They noted the condition of the building or of the monuments. They noted the deterioration and they prioritized what those conditions were in terms of treatment needs. Next slide. So between the GPS and the GPR, we were able to confirm that, in fact, the Shaker burials, the marker, did in fact correspond to a large area of disturbance down in the bottom right corner. And so the mapping provides sort of a base map for all the design work that subsequently occurred. Next slide. Again, they recorded the condition of the building, excuse me, of the monument, of the object. The slide on the right shows an example of how the stone should in fact be set. This is some of the information that was provided by Tamara in a manual that was provided to all the participants in the workshops. Next slide. The information was put onto Excel spreadsheets, noting all of the conditions, all the information associated with it, the type of material that was identified, and the style or the type of the monument itself. Next slide. Tamara has her own way of recording information basically on inventory forms. And so all of the monuments were recorded onto these forms that are an easy way to reference information for non-technical readers.
And excuse me. And and you mentioned this just a few minutes ago, but one of the things that she did give us was this booklet and this conservation workshop, and that's actually one of the appendices of the plan. And Tamara was just so great to work with. She's like very passionate about what she does, very knowledgeable. And she gave a PowerPoint presentation at the beginning of this first workshop that we did. And, talked about the basics of stone design, gravestone symbolism, what supplies and materials and chemicals you can and can't use when you're cleaning the stones, and then sort of strategies for resetting stones that are tipping or tipped over. And we learned also, which was interesting, it's something that's very obvious, but I hadn't really considered it, as she said, she's really, a sculpture restorer, except that, if you do that in a museum, Mother Nature isn't, doing her damage. And so, one of the things she talked about is that sort of the patina of these stones is part of, what happens in a cemetery. And so it's really important to document them now while you can still read them, because, in another 100 years, some of these, especially in, more sandstone, more grainy stone, it can, be damaged beyond, knowing what the names are on them. And she did a great job of, sort of talking too about, problems people did thinking that they were doing the right thing, but, did further damage, or if chemicals are used on the grass, the kind of damage that can do to the stones as well. She also shared with us just the different types of materials that are used for stone, marble, the local stone that has been found, and then the zinc, which was a cheaper, less expensive sort of stone that people could, use. And that's kind of a nice one because it doesn't it doesn't wear away in the same way that traditional stone does. And then she taught us all about the different kinds of types of stones that are out there in the world. And then she conducted our workshop. We had 19 volunteers. She brought all the materials, and over several hours, we cleaned 16 gravestones and reset 8 toppled or leaning stones. Our volunteers were so excited that it was time to go home, and they kept staying, and they didn't want it to end. And so the plan document also includes a whole section on the best practices in cleaning and resetting. And so we also have interest from the people who were at that workshop, or who were unable to go, in doing another workshop, now that we have those skills and we've practiced those skills, and we have a document that can guide us in doing that. And it was all over the board. All ages showed up to that workshop. And then we did one with our public works people, because they're the ones who are out there doing the work. And Manic Smith's landscape architect, Wendy Fry, who was the project lead, and Tamara Conde, the gravestone expert, met with our public works staff and talked about safety around leaning monuments. They gave us a statistic, which I can't remember, about the number of people who die every year because a gravestone falls on them, which is pretty dark. But it made us put some cones around a stone, one of the stones out there in the site, because if you're riding a lawnmower that close and vibrating the ground, you could expedite something falling on you. We also talked about best practicing for mowing and weed removal that doesn't do damage to the gravestones. And then we learned from the people, many of these public works workers had worked for the city for decades, and they had an institutional memory of being there every week, mowing the lawn and seeing deterioration, or seeing stones fall or stones disappear. And so they were really helpful in that regard. And then our plan also includes a section on cemetery maintenance, down to the type of cord that you should use in a weed whacker. And then MSG also met with the police to understand security concerns that they had, including how new landscaping might provide better visibility into the cemetery for their staff. And then, picking up on that, our historical society had decided to do a Veterans Day tour, because there were veterans from 5 wars within that cemetery. And so we had, I think, 35 people or so show up to that. And they highlighted the people who served in those wars, but then they also highlighted the pacifist Shaker community that has that mass grave there. And since we had this new group of people who are probably more interested in the veterans, but we also included them in getting their information and their emails, so that we could update them on upcoming, opportunities for volunteering at gravestones, or future tours that we might have. And then in some areas in a distance, the cemetery looks to be pretty well maintained. This is a sort of a picture where you don't see the damage. But the landscape architects on the team took a closer look, and they documented all the plantings and all the trees on the site, but then also came up with a vision of what the cemetery could be. And they documented existing conditions of the landscape. They looked at the periphery and the overgrowth that was going on there, and the damage that it was causing. and what we found was a lot of these invasive shrubbery and trees was damaging the stones. I mean, it's the nature. The roots are going to upend some of these stones. And so, and also the earth around many of the stones was compacted so tightly because of the way lawnmowers do a tight turn around the stone, which further compacts the soil and can cause problems. And so we really wanted them to give us a conceptual landscape amenities plan so that we could use that for future development. And so this is a preliminary plan. We talked about giving us some recommendations for significant historical and environmentally sensitive changes to the landscaping of the site. And what this did, this is not a paved path that is shown, but instead that path is the area that we will mow. And the rest of it the idea was to stop mowing it and allow the rest of the cemetery to be unmown, or at least maybe mow it twice a year. Because in the 1800s, they didn't have lawnmowers. So we had even at one of the meetings talked about the possibility of having goats come in to quote unquote mow the lawn. But I did not want to be in charge of the goat, and the public works staff surely did not want to be. This is the suggestion. This took into account where the gravestones were. You can sort of see and very lightly the rectangles represent burial sites and the dots represent headstones. So the idea was that we would mow just paths and they wouldn't go over any graves. They would kind of find their way between the graves. And then we would remove invasive landscaping and plant some new landscaping. And most notably on this plan was the idea that row which is on the left side of this drawing along the main road would be removed, those shrubs, and then a hedge row, but that has sort of said it was like curtains. There would be blockage, but there would be places where you could sort of see between to know that there was actually a cemetery back there. One of the things I thought was interesting and it makes sense, but I never would have thought of it, is that whenever you're going to be removing landscaping in a cemetery, you have to have an archaeologist on site. Because you're going to be pulling roots out of under the ground, and they need to be there to deal with remains if they end up getting pulled out during that process. Luckily, on our stakeholder group, we had an archaeologist who said she would volunteer her time when we got to that time in the process. This would more formalize in the lower right, the existing entrance would be more formalized. And then the idea was that a second entrance could come onto that main road. And benches and interpretive signage would be put throughout. And then the no-mow is much more environmentally sustainable. And our stakeholder group loved that idea, as did the Public Works Department, because it saves them staff time. We eventually expect it to attract pollinators, and then it also helps with stormwater runoff. So it's really environmentally and historically appropriate. The other thing that they suggested was some signage. There's one sign that faces Lee Road that no one can read because it's covered in shrubs and it's up at a weird height and you can't see what it says. So the idea was that there could be an entrance sign that would share details of the cemetery's history, and then also in a few select locations, a post that is styled after a Shaker fence post. And that would include a QR code that could tell about that family or that section of the cemetery, and also makes it easier to update. If we learn new information, we don't have to reprint a sign. We just update the information to which the signpost is on the website. So the other thing that was included in the plan were project phasing, which helped us prioritize the order of improvements, and we can implement incrementally as we get funding secured. We had interest in creating a friends group, so there was some information in the plan about best practices for establishing a friends group, and then also they gave us some funding opportunities and cost estimates, and that's really helpful for us as we go for grants to show that we have our handle on what the costs are. And then the fun part, which is the implementation. Our Landmark Commission and Planning Commission recommended City Council adopt a plan. They adopted it on April 25th. And then the top priority at that time was cleaning and resetting 57 gravestones. Those were the most endangered gravestones, and the cost for that is about $40,000. So we applied for a CLG grant to do that. They keep pushing the deadline, but we're expecting to hear this month about whether we got that grant. We feel pretty good about it, and we applied for $25,000, and we've got $15,000 budgeted for our match. And then 4 days after council adopted this plan, we started the implementation of the mown paths. And so this is our electric lawnmower doing his job. And so on the right is that first day of mowing. And then this was over the last month, what happened. This is the area where there are burials, but there are no headstones. So the progress has been sort of fun to watch. Then so this is the we got the stones, and then this is what we're working on now. And then we'll move on to our next priority, which is dealing with this Lee Road frontage, and we'll be removing that overgrown shrubs, engaging landscape architect to design a historically appropriate and environmentally sustainable landscape plan, and discovering and documenting any grain stones that got tangled up in there with those overgrown shrubs, and we'll reset those. And then we're planning a road diet and a streetscape plan along that road for implementation in 2025. So we're hoping to kind of tie this in with that and work those two things in together. And as we do the restoration and resetting of those stones, we're going to update that spreadsheet that Maura mentioned for all the stones and any updated GPS information as we reset the new stones, because they gave us all that raw data so that we could update it. And what we'd like to do eventually is, take that GPS data and perhaps have a mobile app or some way in which someone could stand next to a stone and learn more about the people or the family that was buried there. And I would say the best part of this project is seeing the way the community was so excited to learn about this cemetery and show up for workshops and tours, and marveling at the history of truly a hidden, little 1 acre gem of a cemetery. And now we have built-in volunteers and stewards as we move into the plan implementation, people interested in starting a friends group. And the Ohio Historic Preservation Office has a best practice document that they can share with other cemeteries so that they can learn from what we completed in this historic preservation master plan for the cemetery. And with that, the plan is on this website, the city website. It's 239 pages with all the appendices. But the plan itself is about, I think, 35 pages. And Maura and my contacts here, we're happy to answer questions or hear comments about the plan. And that does it for our part of the proposal, for the presentation. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Kara and Maura, for that really fascinating look at the Warrensville Cemetery. Yeah, we are willing to open it up for questions now. I see that there's a question from Joe in the chat already, so I'll just share that. Was there any existing recorded listing of burials?
Yeah, and I think maybe Maura can answer that. I guess there was by our historical society, and I know Maura poured through that as they were pulling together the history, so I'll leave that to you.
That's it. Yes, there were extensive records of who was buried there, but not locational information. So a lot of what we had to do was, if inscriptions were still visible on the stone, we had to tie it back to what inscription had been recorded. I think that was taken back in the 1960s. There was a comprehensive survey done where inscriptions were transcribed, but making sense of that and tying it back to the geophysical information was one of our challenges, one of our tasks. And let me add, I mean, Kara had fun with this, and I imagine, well, as a historic preservation consultant, the large bulk of the work that Manneken Smith does is in compliance in Section 106. And man, it can be a grind. It can be a real grind. But working on a project, and one particularly disappointing aspect of seeing Section 106 and how it's implemented is the reluctance of agencies to do any kind of meaningful public involvement. And this was really, it filled my heart to actually meet the spirit of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and serve the public interest and doing a project that was so, that got so much public support. That really was, and kudos to Kara for putting that together and recognizing the importance of who we're serving really with these historic preservation projects.
Yeah, that was fun. Everybody was so enthusiastic to our
Mhm.
stakeholder group and all the
Mhm.
attendees. So it
Mhm.
was really fun.
Yeah, go ahead, Melanie.
Hello, thank you again for that presentation. Very interesting work. I was just curious with the stakeholder engagement, were you aware of any descendants that had any ties to the cemetery who were interested in getting involved?
Yeah, we worked, our local history librarian is tied into a lot of genealogical societies. And so she was trying to kind of connect with them. The problem is that the last burial there was in 1950. And so we weren't really able to connect with anyone who was tied into it, because that was one of the ideas we had, is that we would have liked to have someone, but we just weren't able to connect with anyone who had had that background. But because our local librarian is very tied into that community, you know, that was helpful to have her as one of the stakeholders.
Yeah, Professor Tomlin.
I'm curious about the improvements. You mentioned there was a 1919 improvement plan. What was the nature of the 1919 improvement plan and subsequent plans? The reason that I'm kind of curious is that the treatment of the cemetery, by virtue of the machinery available, you mentioned lawnmowers, but the treatment of the headstones and other markers has changed over time. But that's the kind of physical manifestation. There's also changes in the horticultural preferences. I noticed, for example, in your plan going forward that you're going to introduce a pear tree. I found that curious. There's a whole history of horticulture in Northeast Ohio that is linked to the horticulture in New York State. But the reason I'm reflecting on this is not only in the fieldwork course, Design Connect fieldwork course, we're often tasked with the responsibility of trying to find, you know, suitable substitutes, and a pear tree wouldn't come to mind, you know, as an ornamental instantly, although it's not entirely, you know, unheard of either. So the changes, I guess, is what I'm wondering about in the early 20th century.
Well, and Maura, maybe you can talk to the retaining wall piece and I can talk to the landscaping piece.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the landscape goes, it is funny because we had, you know, the landscape architects, there was 2 landscape architects with Manneken Smith who were on site with us. And then one of our people on our stakeholder group was a landscape architect for the Cleveland Metro Parks. And then there was an expert on native species, a real native species purist. And so there were these 2 overgrown yew trees, which we believe were planted around the time that they put the stone in to mark the mass burial of the Shakers. And people felt that that was like historically, they kind of created like a gateway or a demarcation. But the landscape architects were sort of saying, well, they make a really beautiful sort of cove over it, but they're probably at the end of their life. So what do we do? And the native species expert was like, they're not native, get them out of here. And so we had this, and the landscape architects said, well, on one day, I feel like we should get them out of here because they're at the end of their life and they're not native. And then the other hand, they were planted as part of this area that was recognizing the Shakers. And they said, we keep going back and forth on what we should do. And so that was a piece of, sort of marrying, the historical plantings with, native species and them, being at the end of their lives. And so basically at this point, we are not doing anything about it. So, the plan that they gave us is a real basic plan. It's real sort of high level. When we get into the landscape piece, we're going to have to hire a landscape architect and maybe Manick Smith again, and perhaps with someone who's an expert on, historic plantings and native plantings to help us figure out how to replace some of those that are really doing damage. That's that piece of it. We haven't really gotten into the details of how the landscaping is going to be laid out, but it's complicated when you're dealing with those historic plantings that aren't necessarily what are seen today as the right kind of plantings when you're looking from a sustainability standpoint.
Right, and you're talking about layers of history at the site, and many changes and many aesthetics have formed what it looks like today since 1811. The retaining walls were built, and I think there's some concrete retaining walls back in the back end of the property that are much more recent. But I don't know if you remember the slide that showed the cemetery in the far left-hand corner sort of fading away into the road. There was a lot of objection about the nasty look of the cemetery in the early 1920s as the subdivision, as the housing development, as Shaker Heights was taking form, which was a very well-regulated and tidy community and community aesthetic. So the stone wall was built at that time and it is a product of its time that has achieved its own significance. So the wall is a later addition. That's not the picturesque ridge that was in the Warrens' back corner, but is now sort of a well-defined edge right up against a grocery store parking lot. So.
And I will say one of the other things that was interesting as far as its location next to the grocery store is, where my office is at City Hall, and the grocery store, it's a I don't know, 6-minute walk. So I walk there often to grab a sandwich or something. And so I took to cutting through the cemetery because I was just sort of seeing what things were doing. And I realized that lots of people who work at the grocery store on their lunch break would sit on the edge of the retaining wall against the parking lot, dangling their feet and trying to eat their lunch off their laps. And I said, would you like a bench here? And they said, yeah, that'd be great. We come here, we sit in the shade. It's really pretty. So it was being used in this sort of ad hoc way. But, we tried to get the grocery store employees, kept them in the loop, and their boss said he put stuff in the break room. We tried to get them to give us some feedback on what they'd like to see there too.
But I think in answer to Michael's question, I don't think there was any attempt to re-inject any kind of period appropriate plantings because there's little documentation of what was there historically. Yeah, the pear trees are not a genus that was known back then or commonly used, but we really don't have a record of what was planted there per se.
Thank you both. The seasonality is the other thing. Most of the photographs you showed basically, limited the Northeast Ohio like Ithaca as 4 seasons. The nature of the representation in landscape terms is is often in the original design much more marked than subsequent consideration of the changing, whether it's the pear tree. Pear tree has a delightful blossom, but it doesn't last long. Was there any discussion among the landscape architects about the seasonality of the color associated?
I'll be honest, we didn't get into a lot of that, and I sort of feel like what they show was a little bit of placeholder-y type situation, because it's really not a landscape plan. Like, we didn't have a grading, we didn't do a survey of this. It wasn't in the budget for us to do a survey. And so I think, the next phase, as we get to that part where we're starting to tear things out, is we're gonna have to contract with somebody to give us that. And I think those are the kind of things that I think are important, the color in all seasons, or things that don't, especially with the climate changing, things that will, last a while. But we also have to think about, the spread of things. Someone said, oh, it'd be great to have a big, have big tree here. But the reality is, if it's going to do damage to the headstones, if the roots are going to do damage to the headstones, it's not the right plant. We've already got that problem. We don't want to keep, doing that over and over.
Thank you, Buzz.
All right, let's go to Joe's question, and then we'll take our quick little break for the next session.
Actually, it's two parts. I'm getting the sense that the cemetery has gone from being viewed as not being viewed at all. Most people probably didn't even know it was behind the stone wall, to something that hopefully there has been a development of appreciation. I like the idea of the way you're mowing, in a sense, using mowing to create paths. For how long has that been done, and what kind of a reaction has that gotten?
Well, we've just done it for a month.
Okay.
I think that the public works staff, I happen to walk over there because I'm taking a picture from the same spot every couple of weeks to sort of document it. And then I'm going to have someone younger and more adept than me create some sort of video that shows it sort of evolving. But I ran into our public works assistant director, who was out there admiring it. He said, we just love this. It's so great. It saves us time. It looks beautiful. And we haven't heard much from the community. We've been posting on the No Mow. I didn't even realize this, but No Mow May is a thing. And so our social media person posted, took a little video of the first mowing of our lawnmower, our electric lawnmower doing the mowing. And all of the comments were not about the lands, like what we were doing in the cemetery. It was like, what kind of mower is that? Like, everybody on social media was curious about our new electric lawnmower. And some people said, oh, that's great that you're doing that. But we were just talking about doing another update now that the mowing, it feels more like a meadow now. And we're doing a lot of no mow areas in our parks too, just from a sustainability standpoint as well. So, and the community's been pretty supportive of that. So it's a little hard to get mad about it if we're saying we're trying to return it back to, its historic roots. And it's literally one of the oldest things in the whole community.
So prior to this year, how often would the cemetery be mowed, and how often do you anticipate mowing the paths?
So it was mowed like every week, pretty much from spring till fall. And then we're kind of watching it. And I'm sure I will be I have been sending the pictures that I take to Maura's colleague, who's a landscape architect, just to show her. But I think the idea is that we would mow it. They'll just keep doing this, and maybe once or twice a year, we'll mow the whole thing down to let it go again. So I'm anticipating probably in the fall they'll do a full mow of it. And then, which will bum me out, because it was a real pain for us to mark all those paths. I was out there with little flags and spray paint, and then I was sort of walking like this with the lawnmower following me, to kind of, with the plan in my hand, trying to kind of put the paths in. So now they don't need those marks anymore because it's so obvious.
All right, thank you, everybody. It's noon now, so I think what we'll do is you're welcome to stay on and continue to chat, but we're going to take a quick 5-minute bathroom coffee break and then reconvene at 12:05 Eastern Time for Michelle Anderson's presentation.
Thank you.